The blizzard came too fast. Within moments, the temperature dropped to -35. While many stayed warm beside glowing fires, some lives were left exposed to the cold. An elderly man and woman, abandoned by their own children, became homeless as the storm closed in. Alone and out of time, they stood on the thin line between life and death. Then a Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd appeared in the snow. What followed was something no one could have expected. Do you believe God still sends help this way? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, share how this story makes you feel, and don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling meaningful stories. The wind came first, quiet, polite, almost courteous. It slipped down from the mountain as if it had learned manners from old churches, brushing the town's streetlights and tugging at porch chains with a soft, testing hand. It did not roar. It listened. It moved the way winter always moved in places where people were few, like something ancient checking whether the world still had warmth worth stealing. Walter Hensley stood on a front step that no longer belonged to him. He was 73, built from the kind of work that never asked permission. Thin but stubborn, shoulders slightly rounded from decades of lifting what life dropped in front of him. His face was carved in angles and weather, a square jaw softened by time, cheekbones sharp under wind-burned skin, and a gray stubble that grew unevenly because he often forgot razors mattered. His eyes were pale brown, the color of old varnish, and they carried a look that wasn't exactly fear, more like a practiced readiness for disappointment. He wore a patched canvas coat that had once been tan, now faded into something closer to dust, and his hands were bare because gloves had become a luxury he saved for later. Behind him, Irene Hensley stood with a small overnight bag that sagged as if it too was tired. She was 70, petite in a way that made the world seem built too large for her. Her hair, silver and fine, had been twisted into a low knot beneath a wool hat that didn't quite cover her ears. Her skin was pale with that faint translucence that comes with age, and her cheeks had the pink touch of cold already claiming them. Irene's eyes, however, were clear, sharp gray blue, steady as winter sky just before snowfall. She had a way of looking at things that made Walter feel seen even when he wanted to disappear. Her breathing was the only thing that betrayed her. A shallow hitch, a quiet cough she tried to swallow, as if politeness might keep her lungs from betraying her. The door behind them had closed with a sound that was not loud, but it was final. No screaming, no shattered plates, no cinematic cruelty, just a brief, clipped sentence delivered from the other side. Something like, "It's not working, Dad. You can't stay." And then the latch clicked, and the world pretended it had done nothing. Walter's pride tried to stand up straight. It did, for about 3 seconds, then it folded like a chair with one broken leg. He turned his head slightly as if the house might change its mind if he didn't look directly at it. A laugh, thin, dry, caught in his throat, and he forced it down. Pride was a strange animal. It never died. It just learned to hide in the ribs. Irene's fingers found his sleeve, not tugging, not pleading, just touching the way a lighthouse touches the horizon, quietly, insistently, reminding a lost thing which direction is home. "Walter," she said, voice gentle and tired, "we'll go." He nodded like a man agreeing to a plan he'd made himself. They moved through the town's edge where the houses thinned into dark pines. Their boots crunched over packed snow that squealed softly under weight. The road was a ribbon of pale ice, and the air had the sharp smell of metal, a taste that hinted the temperature was about to drop with vicious speed. Walter kept walking because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean hearing the echo of that door. A mile out, the town's weak light fell behind them. The mountain rose ahead, black against a sky the color of bruised steel. Irene coughed again, this time not fully hidden. Walter slowed and glanced at her. She offered him a small smile, one that said, "Don't you dare make this harder by feeling guilty." Guilt, of course, heard that and moved in anyway. "I should have," Walter began. Irene lifted a hand. "No." That was all. One word firm as a nailed board. Walter swallowed. His throat felt raw. "The old cabin," he said instead, redirecting the thought like a river forced around stone. "I can get us there. It's not far." He had once worked maintenance for a mining outfit that no longer existed. When the company pulled out, they left behind more than empty shafts and rusted equipment. They left scraps of shelter, cabins, sheds, a forgotten world where men had eaten canned beans and told jokes to keep the cold from eating them alive. Walter remembered one of those cabins near the lower ridge. Not safe, not comfortable, but it had walls. It had a roof. It had, if luck was still listening, enough to keep Irene breathing. They reached it just as dusk began to thicken. The cabin sat hunched among the trees like an old animal that had learned to sleep standing up. Its windows were dark, one pane cracked and webbed with ice. The door leaned slightly on its hinges, warped from years of snow. A drift had piled against the north side, and icicles hung from the eaves like teeth. Walter exhaled. "Here." Irene stood for a moment, her gaze sweeping the place with quiet judgment. She didn't flinch. She didn't complain. She simply nodded once, as if accepting a bargain with the gods of weather. Walter pushed the door. It opened with a reluctant groan, the sound of wood waking from a long, miserable dream. Inside, the air smelled like stale pine and something faintly oily. There was no electricity, no heat, just a cold that lived in the boards and refused to move out. Walter set the bag down and stepped forward. His boots left shallow prints in dust and old grit. The floor creaked beneath him and a small shiver ran through the cabin as though it resented being disturbed. Irene coughed twice. Walter turned sharply. "Sit!" he said, more command than comfort, because command was what he had left. He pulled a wooden chair toward her, wiped its seat with his sleeve, and guided her. "Down." She sat and looked up at him. Her eyes softened. "You're doing fine," she said. Walter's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile if his face remembered how. He moved to the back wall where an old stove sat like a dead bull. He checked the ash pan. Empty. He checked the flue. Clogged maybe, but workable. He found a few scraps of wood in a crate, dry enough to burn if the fire chose to care. He struck a match. It flared bright, a tiny sun born for a brief life. Walter held it to kindling, and after a moment, an almost offended pause, the flame took. It was small. It was weak. But it was something. In places like this, something could be the difference between morning and never. Irene watched the fire with the quiet reverence of a woman who had seen too many endings and still believed in beginnings. The wind outside strengthened. It pressed against the cabin walls, testing seams. Somewhere above the ridge, the air shifted, a deeper, cold sliding down like a verdict. Walter rubbed his hands together. "We'll ride it out," he said. "Just one night." He did not mention the way Irene's cough sounded rougher now, like paper tearing. He did not mention the way her shoulders trembled when she tried to inhale deeply. He did not mention the way his own fingers had begun to numb already. Instead, he busied himself with survival, pulling a threadbare blanket from the bag, tucking it around her shoulders, placing the weak fire between them and the worst of the room. Minutes passed, then more. The cabin warmed by the width of a sigh, and then Walter noticed it. A mark on the wall near the door, half hidden by shadow. A red painted arrow, faded but unmistakable, pointing deeper into the cabin's interior. It was not graffiti from bored teenagers. It was deliberate, practical, the kind of sign men left for other men when they didn't want to speak out loud. Walter stared at it until his eyes watered. He hadn't seen that mark here before. Or had he? Memory was a tricky thing. It could lie with confidence. He stepped closer. The paint was old, cracked like dried blood, though it was only paint, only pigment, only a warning someone had left behind. He lifted his hand, almost touching it, then stopped. Something about it felt wrong in the way a smile can feel wrong when it arrives too easily. Behind him, Irene's voice floated softly. "Walter?" He turned. "Yeah." Irene nodded toward the stove. "That smell," she said. "It's not just old wood, someone's been here." Walter's spine tightened. The thought was absurd and yet perfectly reasonable. The cabin was off the road but not invisible. People in desperate places found desperate shelter. Hunters, drifters. Men who didn't like being seen. Walter tried to laugh it off. The sound came out thin. "Nobody's out here," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The fire popped once, like it disagreed. A gust hit the cabin hard. Snow sifted down from the eaves. The roof creaked. Irene coughed again, longer this time, and her hand went to her chest. Walter moved to her in 2 strides, kneeling. "Breathe," he said softly, forcing calm into his voice like a man forcing warmth into frozen hands. "Slow, slow." She obeyed because Irene was the kind of woman who could still choose grace even while her body betrayed her. The wind outside changed pitch. Not louder, heavier. Walter listened. He'd lived enough winters to know the difference between noise and warning. This was the sound of air thickening, of cold gathering itself like a fist. He rose and walked to the door, pressed his ear to the warped wood. At first, nothing but wind, then a faint metallic tick, another, a rhythm that didn't belong to branches. Walter's eyes widened. He pulled back, breath fogging in the dim light. Irene watched. Him, her expression calm but alert. She didn't panic. She didn't ask questions she already knew he couldn't answer. Walter took a step toward the red arrow again. And that was when he saw the floor marks near the threshold. Faint scuffs in the dust, as if something heavy had been dragged across the boards not long ago. His stomach tightened. The fire's glow seemed suddenly smaller. Outside, the wind pressed a palm against the cabin. Walter swallowed hard, then did something he hated. He admitted the truth without saying it. He turned to Irene. "Stay close to the stove," he said. "Don't move." Irene nodded, her gray-blue eyes steady as winter light. "I'm right here," she said. Walter's hand hovered near the latch. Not opening. Not yet. Just hovering. Like a man waiting to see whether the world would strike. He looked again at the red arrow on the wall, at the cracks in the paint, at the way it pointed as if it had always known, the direction trouble liked to travel. Walter's voice came out low, almost a whisper meant for the cabin itself. "This isn't new." And in the cold that followed, the cabin felt less like shelter and more like a place that had been waiting. Night did not arrive like a curtain. It arrived like a verdict, slow, weighty, and certain, settling over the lower ridge until even the trees seemed to hold their breath. The sky turned the color of iron left out too long, and the stars looked sharp enough to cut. Inside the cabin, Walter Hensley kept moving because stillness was a liar. Stillness told a man the worst had already happened. Movement, at least, could pretend it was doing something about it. Walter's boots scraped across the old floorboards as he checked corners, seams, and gaps where wind could slip in. His joints complained with every bend, but he refused to acknowledge them. A lifetime of being poor had trained him in one sacred ritual: deny weakness until it becomes impossible. Irene sat near the stove, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The little fire Walter had coaxed into being was now a thin, orange mouth, licking at kindling with the lazy patience of something that knew it would win, eventually. Irene's coughing had softened into a tight, contained rhythm, like someone trying to keep their lungs from making a scene. She hated being a burden. That was Walter's job. "You should rest," Irene said, voice rasped by cold air. Her words were calm, but the effort behind them was not. Walter glanced at her. He tried to smile the way he used to smile when he was younger and believed smiles could fix things. The expression made his face feel unfamiliar, like wearing a stranger's coat. "Soon," he said. "I'm just making sure we don't freeze to death in a place that smells like old regret." Irene's lips twitched. A quiet laugh escaped her, half humor, half ache. Walter took the sound like a blessing. He didn't deserve it, but he took it anyway. He rummaged through a battered crate near the back wall and found what every poor man learns to love. Leftovers of someone else's life. Rusted nails, a length of rope, a crumpled tarp that smelled of pine pitch and damp metal. He pulled the tarp toward the cracked window and fastened it with nails and the heel of his boot, working with stubborn precision. The wind hit again, harder now. The cabin trembled. Walter felt the temperature drop not in the air, but in his bones. It was the kind of cold that made a person's thoughts slow down like a clock in thick syrup. He checked Irene's hands. Her fingers were pale, the skin thin and papery. He rubbed them briskly, trying to push blood back into places it wanted to abandon. "How's your breathing?" he asked. Irene's eyes stayed on the fire. "Like my lungs are angry at me," she said softly. "But they've been angry for years." Walter swallowed. He had no medicine, no oxygen, no warm house, only himself, and a cabin that had the manners of a coffin. He melted snow in a dented pot over the stove, watching it turn from white to clear as if purity had to surrender to become useful. When it warmed, not hot. Just not ice. He handed the cup to Irene. "Small sips," he said, pretending he was a doctor and not an old man who once fixed broken pipes for a living. Irene obeyed. Her hands trembled slightly around the cup. Outside, the wind began to howl in a different register. Less screaming, more grinding, like the mountain was shifting its jaw in its sleep. Walter didn't like that sound. In the old days, miners learned to read the earth the way sailors read the sea. The mountain did not always announce danger with drama. Sometimes it simply changed its language. Walter listened and something in him tightened. He turned away from Irene so she wouldn't see the fear trying to crawl up his face. Then he saw it. A narrow interior door he hadn't noticed earlier, half hidden behind a leaning shelf. It looked newer than the rest of the cabin, not freshly built but less decayed, as if someone had bothered to maintain it long after everyone else stopped caring. Walter approached, cautious. He pulled it open, a storage room. Not much inside, just a metal locker with flaking paint, a stool, and a box on the floor wrapped in waxed paper. Walter's breath fogged as he crouched. The box was light. He opened it. Inside was an emergency blanket, one of those metallic sheets that crinkled like foil and reflected heat back at the body. It was old, but intact. There was also a hand-crank radio, scratched and dented with a faded label that read, "Winter Aid, property of Station 4. Walter stared at it as if it were a relic. He hadn't expected mercy to come in plastic and rust. He carried the radio to the stove, sat down hard on the floor, and began cranking. His knuckles protested. The mechanism clicked like teeth. Static answered first, long, indifferent waves of it. Walter kept cranking anyway because stubbornness was the closest thing he had to prayer. A voice finally broke through, distant and warbled, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. Anyone. Copy. This is Winter Aid Station 4. Weather advisory. Extreme conditions. Do not travel. Repeat. Walter froze. The voice belonged to a woman. Steady, unhurried. Someone who had learned to keep her tone calm even when the world was on fire. Her name came through next, distorted but recognizable. Evelyn Moore. Walter had heard of her. Everyone in the county had. The kind of volunteer who remembered faces, brought soup without being asked, and spoke to strangers the way a pastor speaks to the grieving. He cranked harder, desperate. Station 4, Walter rasped, leaning close to the radio. This is Walter Hensley, near the Lower Ridge cabin. My wife's sick. Static swallowed his words, chewed them, and spit them back out in pieces. He tried again. Irene. She can't, he said, but the sentence collapsed under a cough he didn't realize had climbed into his own throat. The woman's voice continued, unaware of him or unable to hear. If you are stranded, conserve heat. Do not exhaust yourself. Help may be delayed. Please stay where you are. Walter stared at Irene. Help may be delayed. That was a polite way of saying, you might die before anyone gets there. He unfolded the emergency blanket. It crackled loudly, bright as moonlight in the dim cabin. He wrapped it around Irene over the old wool. The metallic sheet reflected the stove's weak glow, turning Irene into something almost luminous. A small laugh escaped Walter, half incredulous, half broken. Look at you, he murmured, like royalty. Irene smiled faintly. Then you're the servant, she said. Walter snorted. I've been the servant my whole life. Not to me, Irene whispered, to the world. The words landed in his chest with a soft, heavy thud. He had never wanted a world, he had wanted a home. Outside, the wind intensified. The cabin shuddered. Snow sifted down from the ceiling in fine powder, dusting Walter's shoulders like pale ash. He stood and checked the door. It held barely. He checked the roof beams. They groaned, a slow complaint of wood under weight. Walter tried not to picture what the mountain could do when snow stacked too deep and too fast. He had seen slides before, smaller ones, enough to know the sound didn't come with warning whistles or sirens. It came like thunder without the courtesy of lightning. He looked back at Irene, wrapped in foil and wool, her breath shallow but steady. If the cabin collapsed, she would not survive being buried. Walter's mind began to do what desperate minds do, build plans out of scraps. The storage room door, the locker, the stool, a place that might hold if the roof didn't. He moved the stool beside the storage room entrance, cleared debris and positioned the metal locker as a brace beneath a sagging beam. It was crude. It was not engineered, but Walter had spent a lifetime making the impossible good enough. He returned to Irene and knelt. Listen, he said softly. If it gets loud, if the roof starts talking, he swallowed. We go into the back room. You don't argue. Irene met his eyes. Her gaze was lucid, calm, and heartbreakingly kind. I won't argue, she said. I'm too tired to win. Walter's throat tightened. He looked away quickly, pretending the stove needed him. He cranked the radio again, trying to catch a stronger signal, but the voice faded into static. Somewhere out there, Evelyn Moore was speaking into the dark and Walter was shouting into a wall. The cold kept climbing. Walter's fingers grew clumsy, his thoughts slowed. He caught himself staring at the fire like it was a story he couldn't finish reading. That was when Irene did something that startled him. She began to hum. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, just breath and memory. A hymn, perhaps, or a lullaby, or something older than either. The melody wove through the cabin like a thin thread of warmth. Walter blinked. What are you doing? He asked, half incredulous. Irene's eyes stayed on the flame. Reminding myself I'm still here, she said. The sound was small, but it changed the room. It made the cabin feel less like a trap and more like a sanctuary built from two stubborn hearts. Walter felt a sting behind his eyes. He told himself it was smoke. Then, a sound outside. Not the wind, not the cabin settling. A low, distant bark, one sharp note carried on the air like a question. Walter froze. Irene's humming faltered. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a strange, cautious hope. Walter moved toward the door, slow, careful, as if the sound might shatter if he rushed it. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. Then, far off again, another bark, clearer this time, followed by the faintest hint of an engine straining somewhere beyond. The trees. Walter's heart thudded hard against his ribs, so loud he thought the cabin might hear it. He looked back at Irene. Neither of them spoke, because saying it out loud felt like tempting the gods. But in Walter's face, something shifted just slightly, like a man who had been drowning and finally tasted air. He returned to Irene, crouched beside her and tightened the metallic blanket around her shoulders. "Stay awake," he whispered, voice cracking. "Just a little longer." Irene's eyes glistened. She tried to smile. "Walter," she breathed, barely a sound. "If that's real." Walter nodded once fiercely, as if nodding could make it true. Outside, the wind kept raging, the cold kept hunting. But somewhere beyond the walls, something alive was moving toward them, guided by instinct, stubbornness, or a mercy that didn't bother explaining itself. And for the first time all night, Walter believed the mountain might not get to choose the ending. Mason Greer had always trusted roads more than rooms. Roads made sense. They gave a man direction, distance, and the illusion that he could outrun whatever followed him. Rooms did the opposite. Rooms asked him to sit still with his thoughts, and Mason had learned, through years of discipline and war, that stillness could be louder than gunfire. Tonight, the road through the northern backcountry looked like a scar half-healed. Snow had packed over the asphalt in pale layers, smoothing the world into something deceptively clean. Pines rose on both sides like black spires, their branches heavy with frost. The air was sharp enough to taste, and the temperature had dropped so fast it felt personal, like the mountain had decided someone needed to be punished. Mason drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale inside worn gloves. He was 34, lean and hard in the quiet way of men who had been trained not to waste motion. His shoulders sat squared even when no one was concerned, watching. His hair was dark brown, cut short and practical, with the kind of neatness that didn't come from vanity but from habit. A faint shadow of stubble traced his jaw, more fatigue than style. His face was angular, cheekbones pronounced, mouth set in a line that rarely softened unless he was alone with one creature who didn't ask him to explain himself. That creature sat in the passenger seat. Coda, a German shepherd in the prime of working age, 6, maybe 7, held himself upright like a soldier despite the warmth of the cab. His coat was black and tan, thick and weatherproof, the tan along his legs and muzzle muted under a dusting of snow that had followed him inside. His ears stayed alert, pivoting toward every shift in wind outside. His eyes were a deep amber brown, intelligent and unsettled, as if the night was speaking in a dialect only he understood. Around his neck was no glossy collar, no cute tag, just a faded fabric strap frayed at the edges, the kind that had seen years of real work. Coda was not dramatic. That was the first thing Mason had loved about him. A dog like Coda didn't bark at shadows because shadows were boring. A dog like Coda saved his reactions for when they mattered. Mason's old military watch pressed cool against his wrist. The glow from the dash lit the inside of the cab with a low, tired blue. The heater worked, but only enough to keep the windshield from surrendering completely to ice. On the radio, a woman's voice came and went beneath static. Steady, practiced, carrying that calm that belonged to people who ran toward trouble for a living. "This is Winter Aid Station 4, the voice said, distorted but firm. "Extreme cold warning. Travel is not advised. If you are stranded, conserve heat and remain sheltered. We are coordinating support as conditions allow." Evelyn Moore. Mason had never met her in person, but he'd heard her voice enough times to recognize it like a landmark. She sounded mid-50s, maybe older, warm but unyielding. The kind of woman who could hand you soup and still make you feel ashamed for not taking care of yourself sooner. Mason lowered the volume, not because he didn't respect her, but because he didn't like being reminded that the world contained people still trying was a muscle he'd let weaken. He told himself he was out here for something simple, a supply run, a quick check on an old service post a few miles deeper into the ridge. In and out, no heroics, no ghosts. But that was always how it started, wasn't it? A man making up reasonable lies so fate wouldn't notice him. Coda shifted suddenly, not restless, not bored, alert. His head lifted higher, ears snapping forward. His nostrils flared once, twice, sampling the air that seeped through the vents and cracks. His body stiffened in a single smooth motion, muscles coiling beneath fur. Mason felt it in his own spine before he understood it. That old seal instinct that never retired, only slept lightly. "What is it?" Mason murmured. Coda didn't look at him. Coda stared ahead. The road curved through a narrow stand of cedars, and for a brief moment the wind dropped. In that quiet, Mason noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The snowdrifts along the shoulder were shaped wrong. Not just piled by wind, but disturbed, pressed, flattened in places like something heavy had been moved there. Coda let out a low sound. More breath than growl, a warning meant for one person only. Mason eased off the accelerator. The tires crunched softly. He told himself it was nothing. An animal, a fallen branch, a snowplow earlier in the day, but Coda's posture didn't match nothing. Coda turned his head at last and fixed Mason with a look that felt almost unfairly human. Not pleading, not panicked. Certain. Then Coda stood, bracing his front paws against the dash for leverage, and made a short, sharp huff through his nose, an old, working cue, the kind that meant stop, look, decide. Mason's throat tightened. The last time he'd ignored a cue like that, it hadn't been a dog giving it. It had been a man's voice in a different cold, a different darkness. Telling him not to walk away. Mason swallowed the memory like a bitter pill. "Easy," he told Coda, though the word was mostly for himself. Coda dropped back down, but he did not relax. His tail stayed low, still. His ears remained forward like arrows. Mason slowed more. His eyes traced the tree line, and there, half buried in snow at the edge of the woods, was a strip of orange plastic flagging, the kind survey crews used. It fluttered weakly, as if trying to wave someone down. Mason frowned. No crews should be up here in weather like this. Coda's head snapped toward it, then toward the woods beyond, as if connecting dots Mason could not see. Mason pulled over. The moment he killed the headlights, the forest seemed to grow, larger. The darkness pressed in. Even the air felt heavier, as if the cold had mass. Coda whined once, not fear, not pain, impatience. "You're really doing this?" Mason asked him, dry humor scraping over nerves. "You know I'm not in the mood to freeze to death for a mystery." Coda stared at him. That was the thing about dogs. They never argued. They simply waited for you to become the person you claimed you were. Mason exhaled, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit like a slap, not dramatic, efficient, the kind of cold that didn't waste time. In seconds, his eyelashes felt stiff, his lungs tightened on the inhale as if the air had edges. Coda jumped down beside him, paws sinking into powder with practiced balance. The dog's nose dropped to the snow immediately, sweeping in quick arcs. He moved a few steps, paused, lifted his head, checked the wind, then returned to the snow again. A methodical search pattern, real, trained Mason, followed, boots crunching, breath fogging. Coda led him off the road and into the trees. Only a few yards in, Mason saw more signs. Faint depressions that weren't animal tracks. The snow was too churned, too smeared, like someone had stumbled, maybe fallen. Like something had been dragged briefly, then lifted again. Mason crouched, gloved fingers hovering above the indentation. The cold made him clumsy, but his mind sharpened. Someone was here, he said quietly. Coda huffed as if the obvious bored him. They moved deeper. A few minutes later, Mason's flashlight beam caught something on a tree trunk. A red mark, faded and cracked, shaped like an arrow. Mason froze. The symbol was too deliberate to be random, too practical to be art. Coda stopped beneath it and looked up, then looked back at Mason, ears forward, eyes steady. The dog did not bark. He did not growl. He simply waited, as if this mark was a sentence and Mason was the slow reader. Mason's stomach tightened. He reached out, touched the paint with one gloved finger. It flaked slightly. Old. Not tonight's work. That meant the wilderness had been keeping secrets for a long time. And then Mason saw it. A second mark farther ahead, barely visible. Another arrow. Same red. Same intent. A trail. Mason felt his pulse quicken. Not from fear. From recognition. He'd seen men use simple symbols like this before. In training zones. In places where you didn't want to leave paperwork, only directions. He straightened slowly. The forest around him seemed to lean closer, curious. Coda took 2 steps forward, then stopped again, looking back as if to say, "Now you understand. Choose." Mason swallowed. This was the moment, the fork in the road that looked small but changed everything. He could turn around, go back to the truck, tell himself it was none of his business. He could blame the weather, the darkness, the risk. He had done that once, a long time ago, with a different kind of emergency. He had worn that decision like a hidden bruise ever since. Or he could follow the dog. Mason let out a slow breath, watching it vanish into the air like a confession. "Fine," he said, voice low. "Lead." Coda moved immediately, relief visible in the loosen of his shoulders. He trotted ahead, sure-footed, threading between trees with the quiet confidence of an animal born to work in silence. The red arrows continued, spaced just far enough apart to keep someone moving, just close enough to keep them from getting lost. Whoever had made them understood panic, understood cold, understood how fast a person could lose direction when the world turned white. As they climbed a slight incline, Mason noticed the snow change texture underfoot, more compacted, as if wind had scoured it thinner here. His flashlight caught the faint outline of a structure through the trees. A cabin, low, dark, half swallowed by drift. Mason's heart kicked once, not excitement. Responsibility. Coda slowed, nose high now, sampling air around the building. His ears flicked toward the door, toward the window. Mason approached carefully, flashlight angled down so he wouldn't blind anyone inside if there was someone inside. The cabin's window was patched with something that caught light dully. Tarp, maybe. Then Mason saw it. A faint orange tremor in the crack beneath the door, firelight. Someone had heat. Someone was alive. Coda moved closer to the door and sat, not scratching, not whining, sitting, like a guard at a threshold. Mason's throat tightened. The sight hit him with an odd tenderness, the way small signs of life could feel holy in a world that loved freezing things into silence. He reached for the door, paused, listened. From inside he heard movement, slow, careful, the shuffle of age. Then a cough, ragged and restrained. Mason's hand closed around the latch, and the cold, the mountain, and the old ghosts in his chest all seemed to hold their breath with him. Mason did not knock. Knocking was polite. Politeness assumed safety. He tested the door first, just enough pressure to feel the resistance. Old wood, swollen by moisture, reinforced recently not well but deliberately. Whoever was inside had expected wind, not visitors. Mason leaned in and spoke through the crack, voice low, steady, stripped of command. "Hey, I'm not here to hurt anyone. It's cold out here. I saw your fire." Inside silence tightened. Not empty silence, listening silence. Coda remained seated at Mason's left, posture calm but coiled. The dog's head tilted slightly toward the door, ears alert, tail still, not aggressive, guarded. The kind of stillness that said someone is alive on the other side of this wood. A cough answered. Rough, controlled, old. Mason exhaled once, slow, making sure the sound carried. "You don't have to open the door all the way," he said. "Just enough to talk." Seconds passed. Snow hissed against the walls. The mountains shifted somewhere far above them. A deep sound like something heavy adjusting its weight. Then the latch moved. The door opened a fraction. A man's face appeared in the gap, lined, weathered, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Walter Hensley did not look like someone surprised to see another human. He looked like someone who had already decided what it would cost. Behind him, half hidden by shadow and reflected firelight, sat a woman wrapped in layers that didn't belong together. Wool, foil, fabric, whatever had been available. Mason lifted both hands, palms open. "My name's Mason," he said. "This is Coda." At the sound of his name, Coda shifted his gaze briefly to Walter, then back to Mason, awaiting instruction. Walter's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Mason. He noticed details quickly, the stance, the controlled breathing, the way Mason positioned his body slightly sideways, never blocking the exit. "You military?" Walter asked. Mason nodded once. "Used to be." That answer seemed to satisfy something. Walter opened the door wider. Warmth, thin, fragile warmth, spilled out and met Mason's face like a memory. The smell of old wood, damp fabric, and something faintly medicinal drifted with it. Inside, the cabin was smaller than Mason had expected. Not cramped, but compressed by years of neglect. A weak fire burned in a rusted stove. A tarp covered the window. Snow dusted the floor in fine white lines. The woman looked up. Irene Hensley's face was pale, her cheeks hollowed by age and cold, but her eyes were striking. Clear gray-blue, steady, assessing. She studied Mason the way someone studies weather, not with fear, but with attention. "You can come in," she said softly. "The cold's already inside anyway." Mason stepped through. Coda followed without being told. The dog paused just inside the threshold, nose lifting, sweeping the air in a slow arc. His body relaxed a fraction, but only a fraction. Something here required respect. Walter shut the door carefully and slid a thick board into place as a brace. For a moment, no one spoke. Mason took in the details. The emergency blanket wrapped around Irene, the hand crank radio on the floor, the reinforced beam near the back room. Improvised, practical, desperate but not careless. "You did good," Mason said quietly, nodding toward the setup. Walter snorted once. "Didn't have many choices." Mason shrugged out of his coat and held it out toward Irene. "Put this over the foil. It'll help trap what heat you have." Irene hesitated only a second before accepting. Her fingers brushed Mason's sleeve, cold, trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to stop." Mason met her gaze. My dog disagreed. Coda chose that moment to move closer to Irene, lowering his head just enough for her to reach him without strain. He did not press into her. He simply stood within reach. Irene's lips curved faintly. Her hand rested on the thick fur behind his ear. He's very still, she observed. He's working, Mason replied. Coda's tail flicked once. Agreement. Walter watched the exchange with guarded curiosity. You alone? Trucks up the road, Mason said. Radio's spotty, roads are getting worse. Walter's jaw tightened. They warned us, he muttered. About the cold. Mason glanced at the radio. I heard. The fire popped. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Mason crouched near the stove, extending his hands to the heat, then glanced toward the back of the cabin. The storage room door stood slightly ajar. What's back there? He asked. Walter's shoulders stiffened, just a fraction. Enough. Nothing that'll help, Walter said. Irene's gaze flicked to her husband, then back to Mason. Tools, she said gently. Old things, but there's space. Mason nodded. He didn't push. Instead, he checked Irene's breathing with practiced eyes. Not invasive, not clinical, just noticing. Her chest rose shallowly. Her lips held a faint blue tinge despite the warmth. How long have you been coughing like that? He asked. Long enough, Irene replied. Mason didn't ask more. He'd learned when questions stole more strength than they gave. He pulled a small kit from his pocket. Basic supplies, nothing miraculous. Wrapped a hand warmer in cloth and placed it near Irene's chest, not directly on skin. This will help a little, he said. Not a fix, just time. Time was the most expensive thing in the room. Outside, the wind changed again, not louder, lower. The cabin creaked, not in protest but in warning. Mason's head lifted. Coda's ears snapped forward. Walter noticed both reactions at once. You hear that too? Walter asked. Mason nodded. Snowpack shifting, somewhere uphill. Silence followed, the kind of silence that made people think of ceilings. Mason stood. We may need to move, he said carefully. If the slope above this place goes, this cabin won't hold. Walter's face hardened. My wife can't walk far. Mason didn't contradict him. He walked to the back room instead. The storage room was narrow, reinforced with a metal locker wedged beneath a beam. Mason tested the supports with a gloved hand, applying pressure where it mattered. Better than nothing. This room, Mason said. If the roof goes, this might stay. Walter watched him with something close to relief, and something else. Suspicion, perhaps, or fear of hope. Mason turned back to the main room, and then it happened. Coda, who had been standing near Irene, moved suddenly. Not fast, decisive. He crossed the room, nose low, straight to the wall near the stove. He sniffed once, then twice, then pawed sharply at a loose plank. Wood scraped. Walter stiffened. Hey, don't! Mason was already there. Let him, Mason said. Coda pawed again. The plank shifted. A faint metallic sound answered, soft, unmistakable. Mason knelt and pulled the plank free. Behind it was a narrow cavity in the wall. Inside sat a metal box, rectangular, heavy, cold even through gloves. No markings except a faded serial number scratched into one side. The room felt smaller instantly. Walter's face drained of what little color it had left. Don't, he said hoarsely. Leave it. Irene closed her eyes, not in fear but resignation. Mason did not open the box. He didn't need to. Boxes like this had a weight to them that went beyond metal. What is it? Mason asked quietly. Walter looked away. Trouble. That answer carried decades in it. Mason straightened slowly, holding the box but not lifting it fully into the light. How long has this been here? He asked. Walter swallowed. Longer than us. The wind outside deepened. Snow struck the cabin harder now, more insistently. Mason slid the box back into the cavity and replaced the plank. Coda watched every movement, eyes intent as if memorizing. "We're not opening it," Mason said. "Not tonight." Walter nodded too quickly, agreement born of fear, not trust. Mason stepped back. He met Irene's gaze. She was watching him closely now, measuring him in the way women who had survived long winters learned to do. "You came because of him," she said softly, nodding toward Coda. "Yes. And now you'll stay because of that," she added, nodding toward the wall. Mason didn't deny it. He checked his watch. The second hand crept like it was tired. "We'll shelter here for now," he said. "But if that slope lets go, we move to the back room immediately, no debate." Walter nodded. Irene nodded. Coda sat. The mountain groaned again, closer this time. Mason's eyes went to the ceiling. Not yet, he thought, not tonight. The sound came without drama, no warning crack, no cinematic roar, just a deep rolling pressure beneath the cabin, like the earth shifting its weight after deciding it had carried enough. Mason felt it through the soles of his boots before he heard it. A low vibration that traveled upward, rattling loose dust from the rafters. The stove shuddered. The fire inside hiccuped, then steadied as if uncertain whether it had permission to exist. Walter froze mid-breath. Irene's hand tightened in the emergency blanket. Coda rose in one smooth motion, muscles hardening beneath his coat, his ears flattened. Not back, not forward, but low, the way animals listened when danger was not directional but everywhere. Mason didn't raise his voice. "Back room," he said. "Now!" He moved first, not rushing, not hesitating, positioning his body so Walter could support Irene without losing balance. Walter slid one arm around his wife's shoulders, lifting with a grunt that tore through his chest. Pride screamed, but fear was louder. They crossed the room as another tremor rippled through the cabin. Outside, the wind dropped. That was what scared Mason the most. Silence, when it came suddenly in the mountains, usually meant the world was inhaling. They made it into the storage room just as something heavy struck the north wall. Snow slammed against the cabin with a dull, suffocating thud. The walls bowed inward a fraction, then held for now. Mason braced the metal locker with his shoulder, shifting his weight beneath the beam. Walter guided Irene down onto the floor, propping her against the wall with folded blankets and Mason's coat. The cabin groaned again, wood complaining under pressure. Irene's breathing turned shallow, fast. Panic hovered close. "Look at me," Mason said, kneeling in front of her, his voice calm in a way that had been forged under worse skies. "Just me. Slow breath in. Hold. Out." Irene obeyed, not because she trusted him yet, but because she trusted order. She had lived long enough to know panic wasted oxygen. Coda positioned himself between the storage room door and the rest of the cabin, standing square, unmoving. Snow sifted down from the ceiling, dusting his back in white. He did not shake it off. Another impact hit the cabin, heavier this time. The shelves in the main room collapsed, wood cracked, something shattered, glass maybe. Walter's eyes went wide. "The roof!" "Not yet," Mason said. "If it goes, it'll go all at once." He hated that he knew that. Minutes stretched. Snow pressed harder, sealing the cabin from the outside world like a lid being lowered. The temperature dropped again, sharp enough that Mason felt it bite through his layers. Then slowly the pressure eased, not gone, but shifted. The mountain exhaled. Silence returned, thick and unnatural. Mason stayed where he was for a long moment, listening for secondary movement. Avalanches had a habit of coming in conversations, not monologues. Finally, he eased back, testing the beam with careful pressure. It held. Walter sagged against the wall, breath ragged. Irene closed her eyes, exhausted but conscious. Coda did not move. Mason frowned. Coda. The dog didn't look at him. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the wall where the hidden cavity had been. Mason followed the line of sight. The plank had shifted. Not much, but enough. The vibration had loosened it again. Before Walter could protest, Coda stepped forward and nosed it aside, careful, precise. The metal box inside sat at a slight angle now, its edge visible in the dim light. Mason swore under his breath. "I told you," Walter began. "I know," Mason said quietly. "I know." He crouched, pulling the box just far enough into view to assess it. The weight was wrong, not too heavy, not too light, balanced, purpose-built. There was a symbol scratched faintly into the underside, now visible where snowmelt had cleaned it. A simple mark. 2 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash. Not military standard, not civilian either. Mason's jaw tightened. He had seen that symbol once before. Not on a box, but in a notebook confiscated years ago during a joint task force operation that never made the news. A footnote mission, a quiet one, the kind that ended with everyone signing paperwork agreeing not to remember. He slid the box back without opening it and reseated the plank firmly. Coda watched every movement, tail still, eyes alert. Walter stared at Mason, something like dread creeping into his expression. "You recognize it?" Mason didn't deny it. "Enough," he said. "Enough to know it doesn't belong here, and enough to know it makes this place dangerous in ways cold alone never could." Irene studied Mason closely. Her eyes were sharp now. Pain had given way to clarity. "You came here by accident," she said. Mason met her gaze. "No." She nodded once. Acceptance without comfort. Another sound cut through the quiet. Not snow, not wind, footsteps. Muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. Walter's heart slammed into his throat. "They're coming back." Mason raised a hand, signaling silence. Coda's ears flicked. His body angled, not toward the sound, but slightly off, as if triangulating. He sniffed once, then twice, then turned his head toward the rear of the cabin. Mason followed his line of sight. The slope behind the cabin dropped sharply into a ravine choked with snow and scrub pine. Normally impassable. Tonight, after the slide, it might be the only open way out. Mason's mind moved fast, ruthless. "Walter," he said quietly, "can you walk?" Walter swallowed. "I'll crawl if I have to." "Irene," Mason continued, "can you stand with help?" She hesitated, then nodded. "For a little while." That was all Mason needed. He moved with efficiency born of habit, bundling Irene tighter, tying fabric strips into makeshift support. Walter braced himself, teeth clenched, pride abandoned without ceremony. The footsteps outside grew closer. A voice drifted through the snow. Male controlled, not rushed. "Sheriff's office," the voice called. "If there's anyone inside, come out slow." Mason's eyes narrowed. Not sheriff. Office. He recognized the cadence. Someone who liked authority but didn't want to claim too much of it yet. Coda let out a low, restrained growl, not loud enough to give them away, but clear in its warning. Mason leaned close to Walter. "Do you trust that voice?" Walter shook his head immediately. "No one comes up here this fast, not in weather like this." The voice came again, closer. "We're here to help." Mason almost laughed. He checked the ravine again. Snow had filled part of it, but not sealed it. The slide had carved a narrow, sloping path, downward, dangerous but passable. A gamble, but staying was worse. Mason tightened the last knot, then looked at Irene. "We move when I say," he whispered. No matter what you hear." She nodded. The voice outside reached the door. "I don't want to break this open," it said calmly. "Let's do this easy." Mason met Coda's eyes. "Now!" They moved. Mason shoved the rear panel outward with his shoulder. Rotten wood gave way with a sharp crack, opening the cabin to the ravine beyond. Cold air rushed in, brutal and clean. Coda went first, sure-footed even on shifting snow. Mason followed, guiding Irene step by step. Walter came last, breath tearing from his chest, boots slipping but determined. Behind them, the front door splintered. A man's silhouette filled the cabin doorway, broad-shouldered, bundled in dark gear. Mason didn't look back. They slid, stumbled, half fell down the ravine, snow swallowing their legs, ice biting through clothing. Irene gasped once, then focused, clinging to Mason with surprising strength. At the bottom, they collapsed behind a tangle of scrub pine and rock. Mason held still, listening. Above them, voices echoed, confused, frustrated. A flashlight beam cut across the snow where the cabin had stood, now half buried and broken. Then something else happened. The mountain shifted again. A secondary slide roared down, not massive, but enough to erase tracks, fill the ravine entrance, and swallow sound. When the snow settled, the world went quiet. Mason lay there, heart hammering, lungs burning. Walter sobbed once, sharp, silent. Irene rested her forehead against Mason's shoulder, breath warm against his neck. Coda stood watch, snow clinging to his fur, eyes fixed uphill. After a long moment, Mason exhaled. "That," he said softly, "was too close." Irene lifted her head, eyes shining, not with fear, with awe. "You didn't come here by accident," she said again. Mason looked up at the mountain, now reshaped, indifferent, beautiful. "No," he agreed, "I didn't. The ravine did not welcome them. It accepted them the way winter accepted mistakes. Without comment, without mercy." Mason crouched behind a low outcrop of rock and scrub pine, his back pressed into stone that leached heat through his coat. Snow sifted down in slow, whispering sheets, filling the world with white noise. Above them, the mountain had gone still again, the way predators went still after a failed strike. Walter Hensley sat heavily against a boulder, chest heaving. At 73, his body was all angles and old repairs, knees that had never healed right, hands thickened by decades of labor. His face was ashen now, gray stubble rimmed with frost. He kept one arm wrapped around Irene as if letting go might allow gravity to remember her. Irene leaned into him, her breathing shallow but controlled. Her lips were pale, her cheeks hollowed by the cold, yet her eyes remained clear. They moved constantly, tracking Mason, tracking Coda, tracking the slope above them. Irene, Hensley had learned long ago that survival belonged to those who paid attention, even when the body was failing. Mason knelt a few feet away, one knee in the snow, one boot planted, rifle absent but posture unmistakably military. At 34, he carried himself with an economy of motion that came from years of training and years of regret layered on top of it. His jaw was tight, stubble dark against wind-bitten skin. His eyes scanned uphill, downhill, left, right, mapping danger with the same care other men mapped escape routes. Coda stood between them and the slope. The German shepherd's coat was dusted white now, black and tan muted beneath frost. His breath came steady, clouds puffing rhythmically from his muzzle. One ear angled uphill, the other toward the forest below. His tail hung low, still, a pendulum frozen at the center of a clock that hadn't decided which way to swing. They waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. No voices, no lights, no footsteps. But Mason didn't relax. People who hunted quietly did not rush. They let fear do the moving for them. "We can't stay here," Walter rasped finally, voice tearing against the cold. "She won't last," Mason nodded. "I know." He checked Irene again. Pulse at the wrist, skin temperature, responsiveness. She met his gaze without flinching. "How long can you walk?" Mason asked gently. Irene considered the question with the seriousness of someone choosing how to spend a limited resource. 10 minutes, she said. Maybe 15 if I don't talk. Walter's mouth tightened. "I can carry—" "You can't," Mason cut in, not unkindly, "and you don't need to." Walter bristled, pride flaring even now. Mason met his eyes, steady and unyielding. "Listen to me," Mason said. "If you go down, you take her with you. I won't let that happen." Silence followed. Then Walter nodded once, sharp and bitter. "Tell me what to do." Mason glanced, downslope. Beyond the ravine, the forest thinned toward an old service road, a scar left behind by loggers years ago. If they could reach it, they could reach Mason's truck. If the road wasn't buried, it was the only option that didn't involve waiting for men Mason didn't trust. "We move in stages," Mason said. "Slow, controlled, no lights unless I say." Coda shifted immediately, stepping downslope a few paces and stopping, looking back. "Ready." They moved. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and ice. Mason stayed slightly downhill from Irene, bracing when she slipped, guiding without dragging. Walter followed close, breathing hard but refusing to complain. Coda scouted ahead, stopping often to test snowpack with careful weight, choosing paths where crust held and avoiding areas where drifts hid emptiness. 10 minutes passed, then more. Mason's thighs burned, his lungs ached. The cold crept inward, stealing sensation from fingers and toes with bureaucratic efficiency. They reached a stand of trees that broke the wind slightly. Mason called a halt. "Rest," he said. 2 minutes. Walter sank to his knees. Irene leaned against a trunk, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Mason checked the slope behind them. Nothing. He exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of tension. And that was when Coda did something strange. The dog stopped pacing. He turned, not uphill, not downhill, but toward the east, head lifting sharply. His ears snapped forward, his body stiffened, not in alarm, but in focus. Coda sniffed once, then again, then he sat. Mason frowned. "Coda?" The dog did not move. Snow whispered around them. The forest held its breath. Then faintly Mason heard it too, a sound that didn't belong to wind or snow or shifting earth. A voice far away, muffled but human. "Hello?" Walter's head jerked up. Irene's eyes opened. Mason held up a fist. "Wait," the voice came again. Closer this time, carried unevenly by the terrain. "This is Curtis Vale," the voice called. "Deputy with the county. We're conducting a search. If anyone can hear me." Coda did not react the way Mason expected. He did not bark. He did not growl. He lowered his head. That, more than anything, made Mason uneasy. Curtis Vale stepped into view moments later, framed between two trees like a man emerging from a story he believed he owned. He was in his mid-40s, tall but slightly heavy through the middle, built like someone who had once been fit and now relied on authority more than muscle. His parka was dark, official-looking, the kind issued in bulk. A badge glinted on his chest. His face was clean-shaven, cheeks flushed from cold, eyes sharp and assessing. Behind him, 2 other figures lingered farther upslope. Search volunteers, perhaps, bundled and indistinct. Curtis Vale smiled. It was the kind of smile that practiced often. Pleasant, reassuring, empty of detail. "There you are," Vale said. "We've been looking all over." Mason stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Vale and the Hensleys. "Funny," Mason said. "Didn't hear any sirens." Vale's smile didn't falter. "Roads are bad. We came on foot." From where? Mason asked. Vale gestured vaguely. Down valley. Coda shifted, standing now, body angled subtly toward Irene and Walter. Protective. Vale noticed the dog. His eyes lingered just a fraction too long. Nice animal, he said. Trained? Yes, Mason replied. Something flickered behind Vale's eyes. Recognition? Calculation? We can take it from here, Vale said smoothly. Medical's on standby. You folks are safe now. Walter looked at Mason, uncertainty battling relief. Irene watched Vale carefully, her gaze sharp despite exhaustion. Mason didn't move. Before you do, Mason said, tell me something. Vale raised an eyebrow. Sure. How did you know to look here? Mason asked. The wind sighed through the trees. Vale's smile thinned. We got a tip. From who? Vale hesitated, a heartbeat too long. A call came in, he said. Didn't catch the name. Coda let out a low sound, not a growl, but something deeper. A warning meant for Mason alone. Mason's jaw set. I'm former Navy SEAL, Mason said evenly, and you're standing between me and my vehicle. Vale's eyes hardened, just slightly. The mask slipped enough to show bone beneath. Then you know how this works, Vale said. We don't need complications. Behind Vale, one of the volunteers shifted uncomfortably. Irene spoke then, her voice quiet but precise. Deputy, she said, if you're here to help, you'll let us continue down. My lungs can't handle standing still. Vale looked at her. For a moment, genuine irritation flashed across his face, annoyance at being interrupted by someone he had already categorized as powerless. Then the smile returned. Of course, ma'am, he said. Just wanted to make sure everyone was accounted for. His eyes slid back to Mason, and that no one took anything they shouldn't have. The words landed heavy. Mason held Vale's gaze. Coda stepped forward half a pace. The forest seemed to lean in, waiting. Then Mason nodded once. We're leaving, he said. Now. Vale's smile tightened. I'll walk with you. No, Mason replied. For a long moment, neither man moved. Finally, Vale stepped aside. Be careful out there, he said lightly. Mountains can be unforgiving. Mason did not answer. He guided Irene forward, Walter close behind. Coda stayed between them and Vale until the distance widened. Only when the trees thickened again did Mason allow himself to breathe. Walter whispered, That man. I know, Mason said. Irene glanced back once, then forward, again. He wasn't here to save us. No, Mason agreed. He was here to find something. They continued downhill, the road faintly visible now through the trees. Behind them, Curtis Vale watched until they disappeared, his face unreadable in the falling snow. And Coda, silent, unwavering, never once looked back. The road was no longer a road. It was a memory pressed into snow. Two shallow grooves winding through trees that leaned inward like witnesses. Mason recognized it anyway. Old service routes never truly disappeared. They waited. They endured. Much like the people who once relied on them. His truck emerged from the trees like an answered prayer. Half buried but intact, windshield frosted opaque, tires locked in ice. Mason felt a tightness in his chest he didn't immediately recognize as relief. Walter let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Thought we'd missed it, the old man said, voice trembling. Mason shook his head. Not yet. He moved quickly now, urgency sharpening his movements. He brushed snow from the hood, checked the tires, the exhaust, the undercarriage. Ice had claimed everything it could reach, but nothing was broken beyond use. Coda circled the truck once, nose down, checking for unfamiliar scents. Satisfied, he returned to Mason's side. Mason opened the passenger door and helped Irene in first, moving carefully, supporting her weight as if it were something fragile and irreplaceable. Irene winced but did not complain. Her face was pale, lips cracked, but her eyes remained steady, bright even. "You're very calm for someone who almost died twice tonight," Mason said quietly. Irene gave a thin smile. "I've learned when panic helps and when it doesn't." Walter climbed in next, movements stiff, hands shaking violently now that adrenaline had loosened its grip. Mason wrapped a spare blanket around his shoulders and started the engine. The truck coughed once, twice. Then it roared to life. Warm air, real warmth, began to fill the cab, slow but faithful. The heater groaned like an old man waking up, but it worked. Walter closed his eyes and leaned back, breath hitching. That's good." Mason pulled out his radio and switched frequencies, tuning past static with practiced patience. "Winter Aid Station 4, he said clearly. "This is Mason Greer. I have 2 civilians with me, elderly, 1 respiratory compromised. We're on the Old North Service Road heading downslope." There was a pause. Then Evelyn Moore's voice came through, clearer than it had any right to be. "Mason Greer," she said. "We hear you. Stay on that road. We've got medical and transport en route. You did the right thing." Mason swallowed. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. "Copy," he said. "See you soon." He cut the transmission and put the truck into gear. They drove slowly, carefully, the forest slipping past like a dream someone else was having. Snow continued to fall, but lighter now, as if the storm had spent its anger and moved on. Coda rested his head against the door, eyes half closed but alert. A working dog never truly slept, not until the work was finished. After several minutes, Irene spoke again. "You knew that. Man wasn't there to help us," she said quietly. Mason nodded. "Yes. And you still didn't confront him?" "No." Walter frowned. "Why not?" Mason kept his eyes on the road. "Because he wasn't the end of the problem. He was just standing closest to it." The road dipped, then leveled out. Lights appeared ahead, faint at first, then clearer. Flashing amber, white headlights, rescue. They pulled into a small clearing where a cluster of vehicles waited. Snowmobiles, a medical transport van, a sheriff's SUV parked slightly apart. Evelyn Moore stood near the front of the van, her posture calm and grounded, despite the chaos around her. She was in her early 60s, tall but soft around the edges, silver hair tucked beneath a knit cap. Her eyes were kind but sharp, the eyes of someone who had spent years deciding who needed comfort and who needed direction. She approached as Mason stepped out. "You must be Mason," she said, offering a gloved hand. He shook it. "You're Evelyn," she smiled. "I recognize the voice of someone who doesn't waste words." Medical staff moved in smoothly, guiding Irene onto a stretcher, checking vitals, administering oxygen. Irene squeezed Mason's hand briefly as they worked. "Thank you," she whispered. Walter hovered nearby, helpless and grateful all at once. Coda stayed close, watching Irene with quiet intensity until Mason placed a hand on his shoulder. "She's safe," Mason murmured. Coda exhaled, long and slow, tension finally easing from his frame. Evelyn glanced toward the woods, then back to Mason. "Deputy Vale radioed earlier," she said carefully. "Said he was assisting a situation up the ridge." Mason met her gaze. "Was he?" Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "That's what we're figuring out." Sirens approached, real ones this time. County medical, state emergency response. The night, it seemed, was finally allowing itself to be organized. Walter was escorted toward the van, pausing to look back at the mountain once more. "I thought we'd die there," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Irene turned her head on the stretcher, eyes meeting Mason's. "But we didn't," she said. No triumph, no disbelief, just fact. As the vehicles prepared to depart, Mason loaded Coda back into the truck, then paused. He looked up at the mountain, the slope, the trees, the place where winter had tried to close its fist. Somewhere up there, beneath snow and broken wood, a metal box waited. He felt no pull to return. Some things he knew now revealed themselves not to be solved, but to be left behind. Evelyn stepped beside him. "You staying around?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "No, I think this is as far as I go." She nodded. "You ever need work, real work? We could use people like you." Mason smiled faintly. "I think I just finished something." He climbed into the truck, Coda already settled, eyes forward. As they drove away, dawn began to lighten the horizon, soft and unremarkable and miraculous all at once. Winter loosened its grip, and Mason Greer did not look back. Sometimes the loudest storms are not the ones that fall from the sky, but the ones we carry quietly inside ourselves. This story reminds us that miracles rarely arrive as thunder or fire. More often they come as a moment of hesitation, a decision to turn back when it would be easier to keep driving, a loyal animal sensing what the human heart is too tired to hear, a stranger choosing compassion over comfort. God does not always send answers in ways we expect. Sometimes he sends a dog that refuses to walk away. Sometimes he sends a road that appears just in time. And sometimes he sends a second chance disguised as responsibility. In everyday life, we face smaller versions of the same choice: to listen or to ignore, to help or to hurry past, to believe that someone else will step in, or to become the one who does. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the courage to act while fear is still present. It is trusting that when we choose mercy, even in the coldest moments, God is already walking ahead of us. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about what it made you feel or where you are watching from. And if you believe in stories that restore faith, compassion, and purpose, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling them. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps. May he keep light in your path and warmth in your heart, even when the world feels frozen.